We were actually trying to buy a house, and then we just veered off that into the FIRE direction instead. And that turned out to be the best decision that we ever made. And even after we retired, the same people that said we were buying a house said that we were crazy for retiring, and that it's just because we are in a bull market. If the stock market crashes, we're going to be begging our bosses to let us have our jobs back. And that's when I started the blog, and that's when I came up with the idea that it doesn't make sense to follow the boomers' advice, our parents' advice of saying, get a job, get a pension, and then buy a house, and follow the usual script of life, because the situation has changed and that script doesn't work anymore. I'm actually quite grateful that I grew up in China, because whenever people tell me how bad the situation is here, I always have that perspective that it could be so much worse. And it has served me well in the beginning of my life, because if I did not have that scarcity mindset, now that I have abundance and I have the privilege of time and to be able to spend with my son, and I'm able to see that if I didn't grow up the way that I grew up, there would be no fire lit under me to get to FI. Instead of just blindly going into a degree, because what people don't realize now is that the advice that our parents gave us is you have to have a degree, otherwise you can't get a job. That's not really true in this environment anymore. Degrees are not as, they used to be quite rare, but now they're actually not that rare anymore. And you have to be very strategic in picking one. So pay over tuition is you take how much you would be able to earn after you graduate, and you divide the amount of money that you would spend on tuition. And then you compare the different types of career that you're thinking of getting to make sure that it actually makes sense that you can pay back the tuition. Otherwise, there's no point in getting that degree.
Welcome to Catching Up to FI, a podcast on mindset, money, and life for late starters of any age on their journey to financial independence. I'm Bill, and I'm a late starter.
I'm Jackie, and I'm also a late starter, and we're your host. We're here to help you on your journey to financial independence, no matter where you're starting.
We're going to talk to experts, other late starters, and explore topics related to our mission.
Join us as we catch up to FI together.
Hello, and welcome back to Catching Up to FI. I'm Bill Yount with my co-host, Jackie Cummins-Koski, and we are so excited to have a revolution today. We're on fire with our guests today. Jackie, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm excited for Kristy and Bryce. You know, we've followed their work for a long time. They have some amazing stuff out there. And we were just so lucky that they accepted our invitation. And I am looking forward to this conversation with them.
Now, we have a bonus today because there's a little one in the background. So we're going to have a little background noise. We have to overlook it because parenting is not easy. And podcasting while parenting is even probably more of a challenge. Let me do a little introduction and we'll jump right in. So Kristy Shen and Bryce Leung, otherwise known as Firecracker and Wanderer, are the founders of the popular blog and movement, Millennial Revolution. Kristy grew up in abject poverty in totalitarian China. Her family actually lived on 44 cents a day. She searched on a medical waste dump for toys as a child. They lived in a concrete box with no heating, damp floors, and a bathroom that was just a hole in the ground. Upon immigrating to China, her first Coca-Cola was the most incredible experience of her life up to that point. I wonder if she still has that Coca-Cola can, actually. Anyway, Kristy and Bryce wrote, "Quit Like a Millionaire, No Gimmicks, Luck, or Trust Fund Required." It has sold well over 150,000 copies. It is the story of the lessons that Kristy learned clawing her way back from the bottom 1% to the top 1%. They believe that these lessons are reproducible and available to everyone, regardless of race, the amount of money in your checking account, and the privilege you may or may not have inherited. It is applicable to late starters, which is why we're here today. Kristy and Bryce retired in their early 30s in 2015 now, almost 10 years ago, with a net worth of $1 million. Today, they are still mostly homeless nomads traveling the world and recently had a baby boy. His name is Little Matchstick. Their story has appeared on many media outlets around the world. Their segment on CBC has garnered over 4.47 million views. That's the most in CBC history, and that's one of the largest TV networks in Canada. Their blog has well over 25,000 subscribers, and we believe their story, their wisdom applies to our audience as well. So Kristy and Bryce, it is our pleasure to welcome you to Catching Up to FI.
Thanks so much for having us.
So you guys are parents now. I mean, tell us how that's going.
Pretty chaotic.
It can be chaotic. It's for people who kind of are a little bit control freaks and make their entire life like expressed in spreadsheets with all these like formulas so you can optimize it. Having this chaotic little person in the house just messing stuff up has been an interesting, I guess, journey and transition.
Oh yeah, definitely.
It's about corralling.
See, you just punched me in the eye.
You just punched her in the eye. So it's about corralling the chaos. You used to just travel the world with like a backpack and just changing locations every couple of weeks. Now we have to be a little bit more sedentary and staying in one place for at least the first year because of these vaccinations. But as soon as we can, we're going to be geeking back onto the road next year, and we're super excited about that.
So, all right, Kristy, you've got a child now. You've been retired almost 10 years, and your original number was $1 million. Has a child changed your financial approach to FIRE?
That is a great question because I did not actually account for him as part of my finances when we actually became FI because I didn't think I was going to have a child. So surprisingly, I think one of the biggest advantages we have now that we're FI and with a child is that we don't have to pay for childcare. So from looking at my first year's expenses, it's not actually as expensive as I thought it would have been. It's around $250 a month, at least for during the first year. It could change later on, but that's as far as I know at this point. And it would have been much more had I had to send him to daycare or hire a nanny. And then that made me realize that the USDA number, I think they estimated it would be around $300,000 to raise a child to the age of 17. A lot of that is actually childcare expenses in the first 5 years.
Yeah, it gets expensive when they're that little. So you guys have traveled all over. So currently you guys are in Canada and you've been there since you've had the baby, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, great.
All right. So has this sort of been a fire blower? Has it caused any, impact to, okay, we're going to have a harder time making our numbers? How do we afford college, for example? And how are we going to school the child?
Yeah. So one of the things that's great about Geographic Arbitrage is that reduced the expenses that we needed for the first 5 years. And not only did it get us out of the sequence of returns risk, which is if you have stock market crash right at the time that you retire and you just keep withdrawing and your portfolio cannot sustain that many years of downward trajectory while you're withdrawing money, that helped us not get into that situation because we were actually living in inexpensive places and averaging it out with expensive places. It also helped us in terms of front loading the inexpensive parts of our life in the beginning so that as costs go up now, our portfolio has actually gained so much traction that even the dividends that we're getting from the portfolio is enough to cover our base expenses as well as the additional cost of having the baby.
Okay, so did you start a 529? Are you able with your dividends to save for college? Or is that going to come from your portfolio?
Yeah, so we are putting aside the amount of money that the government is willing to match for us. So in Canada, we have something called an RESP. So if you put $250 in, the government matches it per year. So then if we actually let that compound over the 18 years, it will contribute a lot to his education when he goes to college. Another thing I realized that I really felt was very useful for me going to university for engineering school is that I picked a program with something that's called a co-op, which enables me to work at the same time as go to school. So I would highly recommend something like that for him if he chooses to go to college or university when he's of that age. And I also want to obviously make him read that chapter in my book, which talks about the POT score, so the pay over tuition, so that he knows if he wants to get a degree, it has to be something that is a good investment and not just a random degree. Because otherwise, let's say he decides to follow, he wants to do something that may not be valuable in terms of getting the degree and the math doesn't work out, then there's no point in getting a degree. I'm not 100% attached to the idea of him getting a university degree. And if he wants to pursue his passions, then you just pursue it. There's no point in getting the degree and then getting into a lot of debt when you can work on those passions even without the degree.
So you mentioned a pot score, and I found that the pay over tuition, I found that fascinating because I had never thought of employment that way based on the value of an education. I'm a doctor, and surprisingly, my little pot score wasn't so good compared to computer engineering. Can you take us through what that exactly is and how people should look at maybe optimizing their employment first and their passion second?
Yeah, so pot score stands for pay over tuition. So instead of just blindly going into a degree, because what people don't realize now is that the advice that our parents gave us is you have to have a degree, otherwise you can't get a job. That's not really true in this environment anymore. Degrees are not as, they used to be quite rare, but now they're actually not that rare anymore. And you have to be very strategic in picking one. So pay over tuition is you take how much you would be able to earn after you graduate and you divide that, the amount of money that you would spend on tuition. And then you compare the different types of career that you're thinking of getting to make sure that it actually makes sense that you can pay back the tuition. Otherwise, there's no point in getting that degree.
Yeah, and I think that's also applicable when you're thinking about a lot of these really big student loans that are out there and, you know, looking at the pot score that can kind of help you assess, okay, how much is too much? So I love the idea of the pot score and looking at it that way.
Thank you. I also think that there's a lot of different ways to create businesses online and to be able to work remotely, which is not something that was available when I was looking for advice when I was going to university and trying to figure out my career. So another thing besides just obsessing over getting a degree, another thing that people can consider is how are there other ways that you can develop skills? And this is something that I want to teach my son as he's growing up. How do you develop the skills to be able to be entrepreneurial and create jobs for yourself remotely so that you don't have to rely on a degree?
Yeah, I think that part is totally underestimated. Like your value as an entrepreneur or just coming up with these ideas that, you know, doesn't rely on a degree. So I love that you tackle that. And, you know, and I'm thinking about, you know, in the book, when you were talking about kids, you referenced or did it from the perspective of several other fiery people like, you know, Root of Good and Mr. Money Mustache. And now that you have your own experience, like what advice would you give, and has your thinking changed at all now that you see it firsthand?
I would say that before we had kids, I used to think, okay, you need to drive towards financial independence, you know, and that's the only thing that matters. Like you shouldn't take a gap year. You shouldn't try to take a break. Just put your feet on the gas pedal and then push it all the way down until you get to FI. But now I'm thinking, okay, now that I'm much older and I'm in my 40s and I have a family and I've actually seen what happened to our family members. So unfortunately, my father-in-law passed away from brain cancer last year. And it really, yeah. And the crazy thing is, as his health was deteriorating and we were in the hospice with him, I was actually 9 months pregnant. So it really kind of was like the cycle of life, the circle of life in which you see your father-in-law pass away, but then you're also about to give birth. And then my husband, Bryce, was losing his father, but at the same time becoming a father himself. So having seen, as you get older and you see these life experiences, it makes you realize that it shouldn't just only be thinking about getting to FI and like as fast as possible and don't take any breaks and at the risk of your health, just work until you get to that goal. It should be really stepping back and looking at your priorities. And one of the biggest priorities now for me is health and family. And when you're younger, you don't really think about your health and you don't really think about spending time with your family because you're so busy earning money. But later on, as you get older, health becomes more and more important. And now that I have my son, I want to see all his milestones. I want to see him walk for the first time. I want to hear his first word. I don't want to miss out on any of that. And to me, that's more important than maximizing my earning potential or getting status at work, climbing the corporate ladder. Like all of those things to me are not important. And for those who are driving towards FI, which I think is quite pertinent to your catching up to FI, is that if you feel like it's a bit slower getting there or it's too late to get there, well, the thing is driving towards FI, like at the ignoring everything else and trying to get there as fast as possible, having seen what happened with my father-in-law and having my kid now, I realize that there's a lot of other things that are just as important. And it's okay to take slower path if it means prioritizing your family and prioritizing your health. And you don't have to fully get to FI to see the benefits of all those things. I mean, just even if we had been partial FI, but we had enough money to just take a little bit of time off work to spend time with my father-in-law for the last time, or to watch my kid and his milestones, that makes a huge difference compared to someone who's in massive amounts of debt and, they don't have an emergency savings and they have no choice but to just work and care about nothing else. So the fact that if you have a little bit of FU money saved, or you have a little bit of emergency funds to just give you that breather to be able to focus on your health and your family, it changes everything.
Well, you did it so fast. I mean, you retired in your early 30s, and that's a pretty traditional story for people like Mr. Money Mustache and people in the tech industry that we hear about in our movement. And I felt alone because it didn't resonate with me as a late starter. But do you have any regrets doing it so fast and focusing so much on the number, which it seems like in your book you did a little bit?
Yeah, I think that actually comes from my childhood upbringing. I did it very fast because there was that fear that if I'm not financially sound, who's going to be able to take care of me? And also at the time, I was worried about outsourcing from my job, which is actually still a problem these days with a lot of people worried about AI, worried about outsourcing. So I think at the time, at that age, I don't have any regrets that I did it that fast. But if I were to do it again at this stage, like in my 40s, I think there's like other things that I would prioritize rather than the speed of getting to FI.
Yeah, I felt that fear as well. I was a little bit older before I opened my eyes, but man, I moved really fast because I grew up in poverty, not quite in the extenuating circumstances that you were, but that's a big deal. But it's so interesting to think about how we grow as people and we live and we learn, and it's okay to change our perspective on things. That's what makes our lives so great. And to your point, some of the late starters that feel like they're doing it a little slow or whatever, why are you doing it slow? If it's because of family and other things you prioritize, that's not a bad thing. So I appreciate you being so open and kind of sharing how your perspective changed after you became a parent yourself. So that's pretty fascinating.
Thank you, Jack. Yeah, like you said, life does change over time, and you don't really know what 10 years from now, I might think very differently, and then 20 years from now, right? So you can't really tell what you're going to be like 10 years from that moment. So you can only make the best decision for yourself at that moment, knowing what you know, and you can't really predict the future, but it's good to reevaluate as you grow throughout life.
Yeah, and I'm curious, any other big changes since you guys retired or since the book came out, which is where a lot of us really know you from? What other big changes have happened since you guys retired and did all this traveling and had a kid?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that FIRE changed is my relationship with my parents. Because when I was working, I really didn't have time to fix any of my relationships or have like long conversations with my parents and talking to them about my childhood and their childhood. And what happened as a result of FIRE is that like FIRE doesn't fix all your problems, your relationship problems. It doesn't fix like any internal trauma or childhood trauma you've had, but it gives you the tool of time to be able to work on those things. And it's just my relationship with my parents have gotten significantly better as a result of becoming financially independent. And oddly enough, the pandemic actually caused me to slow down. And because of the pandemic, I had to say no to a lot of opportunities. There was a lot of talks and like TV shows and other book opportunities that I said no to just because everything was shuttered, and I was forced to kind of reevaluate my life and then clear everything from my schedule and just focus on family. And as a result of being FI and not having to worry about work and then actually having the time to sit down and talk to my parents, that has significantly improved my relationship with them. And I think it's one of the reasons why we actually ended up having a child. Because one of the reasons why I was delaying on having a child was because of there's so much like generational trauma that I hadn't really sorted through and hadn't really dealt with. So that's one of the things that FIRE gave me, the time and space to be able to work on myself and work on my relationships.
Wow, interesting.
All right. So, Kristy, one of the things that resulted from your upbringing was a scarcity mindset. And our late starters struggle. I mean, I struggled with a scarcity mindset and moving towards a mindset of maybe abundance and a freedom mindset, as you call it. But you saw it as a superpower. And you say that scarcity made you stronger and poverty taught you 4 vital skills that you fondly refer to as crap. So can you take us through your crap philosophy of scarcity mindset?
That's so funny. It's been a while since I've written the book. I'm like, do I even remember that acronym anymore?
Well, you talk about creativity,
You got it?
Yeah.
resilience, adaptability, and perseverance.
Yes. Okay. So the acronym came about as a result of, I think this is a lot of coming from my dad's teachings of what is called 吃苦 in Chinese, which is eat bitterness, and developing resilience. So I think what that gave me in my childhood is the ability to have a perspective, because you can't change your situation. Like, nobody asks to be given a scarcity mindset. It's not something that you have control over, and you don't have control over the circumstances that you are born into, but you do have this control over how you think of things and how you see the perspective of you versus the world and the situation that you live in. So I'm actually quite grateful that I grew up in China, because whenever people tell me how bad the situation is here, I always have that perspective that it could be so much worse. And it has served me well in the beginning of my life, because if I did not have that scarcity mindset, now that I have abundance and I have the privilege of time and to be able to spend with my son, and I'm able to see that if I didn't grow up the way that I grew up, there would be no fire lit under me to get to FI, because it's a lot easier to spend money that is other people's money that is not tied to the amount of time that you had to toil in a job to get that money. And it forced me to be financially savvy and to actually learn about how to manage my finances. And I'm not really sure whether that's going to happen for my son. I'm actually quite worried that he's just going to be like, well, you know what? You can just take care of everything for me. I don't need to do anything. So why do I need to learn any of this stuff? So it's going to be a bit of a challenge trying to teach him about finances and to teach him and to motivate him to be able to figure this out on his own and not just rely on me giving him money or trying to figure out finances for him. So that's why learning about crap and learning it from the 吃苦 concept from my dad and growing up in poverty, I still think that that really lit the fire under me to get to where I am today. But going forward, it's probably not going to serve me very well, because if I keep having that mindset as I age and as my health gets worse, and I'm constantly only thinking about money and not thinking about health or family, you kind of have to like go 180 and then do a Jekyll and Hyde thing where now, okay, that's already served me in the past. Now I need to prioritize different things, because at a different stage in my life, I'm valuing time and health more than I used to when I was young.
So it sounds like, too, the scarcity mindset becomes a problem when it transitions into a hoarding mindset, as you call it. What do you mean by that?
So it becomes a problem when you become tunnel vision. I learned this from talking to other friends who have also grown up in poverty. And there's research done on this as well, that you end up developing a tunnel vision mindset, because when there is scarcity, that's the only thing you can think of. I mean, you don't really think of breathing, but if all of a sudden someone put a plastic bag over your face and you couldn't breathe anymore, that's the only thing you're going to think of. And that's why growing up in poverty develops this tunnel vision of money is the only important thing. Like, as I said in the book, my mom literally physically beat that into me, that money is the most important thing and nothing else matters. And that's only because you have scarcity and that's the only thing you can think about because you don't have enough of it. But it's easy to get into that mindset if you're in that mindset for too long, then you start missing out on other opportunities. Like, if I hadn't met my husband Bryce, I may not have considered investing, and I wouldn't have thought about the opportunity to use my money to grow more money. I would have just hoarded that money and then put it into a savings account. And now, yes, I'm not getting into debt, but I'm also missing out on the opportunity of the growth of that money. So it's the tunnel vision can really hurt you in the long run. So you just really need to be aware, but then also have empathy for yourself that this is not your fault. If you grow up in poverty, it's not something that you asked for. It's something that happened to you, and you can use perspective to think that that could drive you to become more responsible, but not be so stuck on it that you're having this tunnel vision and at the detriment of everything else and missing out on growth and investment opportunities and only focusing on saving and hoarding money.
Yeah, and I guess that's the beauty of partnership. So Bryce was the one that was focusing on the investments and growing the money and all of that. I wonder if we could hear from him, kind of tell us a little bit about how he was able to balance that and help you feel comfortable with doing other things with your money other than hoarding it.
For sure.
We are super excited for one of our new partners. It's called Create Your Own Financial Plan. And this is a comprehensive video course by our friend Cody Garrett. He's with Measure Twice Money, and he's been on our podcast. And we love this course that he has put out. So if you are a true do-it-yourselfer and you've been wanting to put together a financial plan, check him out. I've gone through the course myself, and I have nothing but praise for it and the quality of work that Cody Garrett does. Cody Garrett is a CFP, so you're getting the mind and the experience of a CFP that you can trust. You just need to go to measuretwicemoney.com/catching up, and you will get $100 off this course. And again, that is Measure Twice Money Catching Up. You know, she was saying that she would have hoarded all the money and kept it safe, but you were the one that somehow convinced her that you needed to invest it and grow it. And I just wanted to learn a little bit more about how you got her on board to convince her that it was okay to invest and grow the money. Just tell us a little bit about what that was like.
Sure. So, I mean, it was pretty tough because when you grow up in kind of like a poor kind of household, you're very, very good at saving money. But the idea of taking on any risk whatsoever in order to grow it, it feels a lot like gambling. And there's not that much of a distinction between one or the other. I think it's because I grew up kind of in a more of a middle class mindset. So I was a little bit more used to the idea of, okay, it's okay to take some safe, controlled bets and accept some near-term volatility because that's how the stock markets work in order to potentially grow it. But a big part of that was I really needed to show her how the math worked. So like whenever we have a disagreement, we usually like resolve it with math. We're a very nerdy couple because we're both engineers. So what really kind of brought her on board was the idea of we're not betting on individual companies like you would if you were to say like, I'm going to bet on Apple, I'm going to bet on Amazon, or I'm going to bet on Tesla. It was really more about buying the entire stock market and kind of like betting on the house. So the analogy to that is kind of like being in a casino where, you know, there's all these slot machines, there's all these like card games, there's all these like roulette wheels that you could play. You don't really know which ones are going to pay out. Some do, and then most don't. But on average, the house ends up making money just with the law of probabilities. So that's kind of what I kind of showed her how index investing really is. Instead of betting on individual companies, you're kind of betting on the entire aggregate performance of the stock market and the U.S. economy as a whole. And the big part of with people that have grown up in poverty is that they're afraid of everything going down to zero and just losing everything, right? So a big part of index investing guards against that because you can't really have the index go to zero. All companies would have to go bankrupt at the same time for the index to go to zero. And that's just not practical. That's not going to happen short of like a nuclear war or a meteor hitting the earth, right? So it's stuff like that that kind of allowed me to kind of introduce the idea of investing and turning it into a passive income, because that's really what it takes to actually like go from just saving wealth to building wealth.
Yeah, and you guys were, because of a little bit of scarcity mindset and fear, a little bit more conservative than a lot of people your age. Can you take us through your portfolio, why you picked it, and how it was a little bit different being Canadian?
Sure. So you probably noticed this if you were to talk to some of the other fire bloggers out there, like Pete, Mr. Money Mustache, JL Collins, even, Alan Donegan, which I think you guys interviewed before. They tend to be a lot more aggressive in their investment in their investment mindset. Like Pete was like 100% equity for like the longest time. He didn't need anything else. And I would normally kind of be on that side of the things, but a marriage is kind of like a balancing act. We do have to compromise. And she wanted to have more of a kind of like a more conservative bent to it. And I'm just like, okay, yeah, fine. It's better to be invested conservatively in a way that we're both agreeing. We're both kind of like in agreement that this is a risk level that's safe for that is acceptable to both of us, rather than just one person just kind of going, well, I'm just going to do it what I think is the correct way. Because guess what? If I'm wrong, guess who gets the blame for that? This guy. What has two thumbs and gets all the blame when things go south? This guy.
That's right. I think that makes a lot of sense. So, but I just thought it might have been a challenge just to kind of, for someone that poverty mindset, because I had it too, is a very strong force. And luckily you guys are engineers, technology, you're in that space where the numbers matter. And like you said, the spreadsheet and the math. So you knew she would respond to that if you made it make sense. Okay.
Yeah. And to your other question about being Canadian, I do have to be cognizant that as much as I love being Canadian and this lovely country and all the cool social services that they have, I have to also be cognizant that we're a relatively small portion of the global stock market. Like our total population is about the population of California. And even then, California's economy is like way bigger than all of Canada's. So we have to make sure that we avoid something called home country bias. Basically, every non-American investor, this is something that that they have to keep in the back of their head. And I was kind of telling Alan before, I was like, don't invest all in the UK because you guys used to be a global superpower, but let's go ahead and say outlook is not so good these days, right? And he's like, okay, fine. So I have to make sure that a lot of my equity exposure is done internationally, specifically the US, because if I were to go all in Canada, it really isn't like we don't have like as big of a tech sector. We're mostly like our economy is mostly based off of natural resources like oil and timber and lumber and that kind of stuff. So our economy is linked to yours, but we don't have the kind of supercharged growth that you guys do simply due to the size and your status as the global superpower.
So Bryce, I have to ask you this question.
Yeah.
So you said home country bias. You really got to be careful if you're outside of the U.S. So we're in the U.S., me and Bill, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of our listeners. So if we're in the U.S., do you think, and we know a lot of U.S. companies, especially technology companies, they got a lot of exposure internationally. Mm-hmm. Do you think it still is needed to bring in other international as an asset class into our portfolio if we're in the U.S.?
Honestly, when you're in the accumulation phase, no, because the U.S. stock market is, as you said, so globally exposed that you really don't need to invest in any other countries because you guys power the rest of the stock market for like the rest of the world kind of thing, right? However, I have noticed a big difference between investing when you're still building towards FI and versus when you're investing after FIRE. And one of the big challenges that I found that if I'm over-reliant on the U.S. stock market is that the U.S. stock market doesn't pay a lot of dividends, right? And when you are retired and actually need that money to live, you do need like kind of like a steady income that is not based purely on capital gains, because if you base your strategy completely on harvesting capital gains, guess what? Not every year there's going to be capital gains. 2008, 2020, there were time periods in which there was sharp drops in the stock market, and for reasons that nobody could have predicted. I mean, like I couldn't have predicted that a pandemic would hit in 2020. Nobody predicted the great financial crisis in 2008. And if you rely too much on capital gains to power your retirement, you run into something called the sequence of return risk, which is something that happens if you retire right before a financial, like a stock market drop. And then when the stock markets drop, you are forced to sell a bunch of units in order to fund your living expenses for the first couple of years of retirement. And if you get really bad luck and the drop is sharp enough right at the beginning of your retirement, you end up decimating your retirement portfolio and not having enough of it and selling up too much of it while everything is down and then not having enough of it to come back up again. So I found that before retirement, if you guys want to go, just US only, that's perfectly fine. It is the highest, best performing index in a typical year, but it is going to be really volatile. And so, that performance does come with a price. And then after you have achieved financial independence, shifting more into international equity markets does allow you to get a higher dividend, because while the S&P 500 will pay like a dividend yield of like 1.5%, like below 1.5%, the European stock markets pay like 3.5%, and the Canadian stock markets pay like 3%. And when you do that, you can create like this steady passive income a lot easier that shields you from the sequence of return risks, and the international markets can be a really good way to do that. But this podcast is mostly about catching up to FI. So for a lot of your readers, they are still in their accumulation phase. And if you're American, it's fine. Just go US, just go all, USA. It's fine.
Well, you talked about yield, and in your book, you mitigated, or no, not mitigated. Well, you mitigated sequence of returns risk by creating a yield shield.
Yep.
And I found that concept quite fascinating. And I want you to take our audience through what you did to mitigate sequence of returns risk, and then tell us how your portfolio has evolved since you've gotten out of sequence of returns risk.
Sure. So sequence of return risk is, again, just guarding against that really negative, that really bad luck outcome of I just retired and the stock market crashed. So the way that I mitigated that when I first retired was first I calculate how much do I need to retire. So for us, it was we had a portfolio of $1 million and our retirement budget was $40,000 a year. So that's like a 4%. That's a 4% withdrawal rate. I made some changes to our portfolio the year before I retired in order to make it both more conservative and second to pump up the yield using some of the techniques I just talked about. And I got the yield up to 3.5%. So your portfolio is yielding 3.5%, about $35,000, and you need $40,000. So that means that you still have a gap of about $5,000 a year that you need to finance by selling stock units that have gone up in value. Problem is that you may not have anything to sell that's gone up in value every single year. The stock market does not go up in a straight line up, right? So my strategy for mitigating that was keeping a cash cushion outside of the portfolio that I just leave in like a checking account that's worth about 3 years of down markets. And I kind of came up with that number because I think the longest stock market crash, if you reinvest dividends, it takes about like 3 years to recover. So that was the longest period of time that you needed to be able to prevent yourself from really selling a stock market units at a loss. So if we take $40,000 as the amount that you need and $35,000 is provided for by interest, dividends, and that kind of stuff, then you really need $5,000. You really need to keep aside $5,000 to equal 1 year of retirement without having to sell anything. So what that really meant for me was I kept $15,000 worth in cash outside of my portfolio to really guard against that sequence of return risk. And I did need to use it because right when I retired, there was this is probably like so far back that people don't remember, but in 2015, there was this Saudi oil crash. It was basically the Saudi Arabian government it was back when the U.S. was trying to achieve energy independence. So there was a lot of like fracking going on in the U.S. and you guys were trying to like drill and get all this oil out of all these like oil reserves that you have. So you didn't need to be as reliant on the Middle East anymore. And the Saudi Arabian government didn't like that. So what they were trying to do was they were trying to flood the oil markets with so much cheap Saudi oil that it caused the oil prices to crash. So that caused the stock market crash back then. It definitely caused one in Canada because our stock market is so heavily based on oil. So because I did that for that first year or two, I did actually need that yield shield, and I was able to use this strategy to remove money from my cash cushion bucket rather than selling anything off. And then when that danger kind of abated, stock market started going back up again, and then I was able to refill the buckets that way. We've now been retired for, I think 9 years now. And as the sequence of return risk kind of goes away and your portfolio grows to a point where you really don't need that, I've since kind of simplified my cash management strategy. I've gotten rid of the yield shields, like that separate cash account. And now I can just live directly off of the dividends because when we retired, we had $1 million and living expenses of about $40,000. Now the portfolio has now grown to, I think right this minute is like $2.1 million. And our living expenses really hasn't changed all that much. I think it's like, you'd have to ask Kristy, but I think it's like something like 45, 50, something like that. And the dividends off of our portfolio is enough to cover that living expense, like on its own. So I don't really need any additional cash cushion out there. I can just harvest the dividends every year. So over time, my cash management strategy has simplified because I didn't need that complexity anymore as we got out of the sequence of return risk. But boy, am I glad that I had that when you first left.
When you did it too, your yield shield included, in order to increase your dividends, you use preferred shares, REITs, corporate bonds, and dividend stocks. Tell us what each of those are a little bit and why you did that?
So this is a little bit of a departure from, I guess, some of the other FI bloggers where they just go all equity all the time and just kind of cowboy it up. Good for them. I'm glad, like, that kind of requires them to have the confidence, I guess, that if the stock market comes down and then they sell some of it off, that it'll come back up like fast enough that they're not going to run into the sequence of return risks. I didn't have that. I was not as optimistic as they did. So some of these other assets that you mentioned, corporate bonds, preferred shares, real estate investment trusts, these are considered kind of alternative investments, which the point of it is to give you less kind of like a high octane growth year over year than equity markets will, but it's meant to give you more of a steady income. So corporate bonds, for example, are bonds that are issued not by governments, but by, Bank of America or Merrill Lynch or JP Morgan and like those kinds of companies. So big financial companies that are still big, stable, and well capitalized, but they are going to be riskier than the U.S. government because it is not conceivable that the U.S. government could go bankrupt, though, depending on where you are politically, that you may or may not disagree with that sentiment. But it is conceivable that JP Morgan might go bankrupt. So those companies, in order to entice investors, they have to pay a higher interest rate than government treasury bonds. So that's one way that I was able to increase the yield. Preferred shares are kind of an instrument that are between fixed income instruments like bonds and equities, in that they are issued as like a debt instrument, but they're traded like shares. But those shares don't represent so much of an ownership in the company like a regular share would. It's more meant to give the investor a higher yield. So for example, while the S&P 500 pays a dividend yield of like 1.5%, like a preferred share index will pay like 6%, for example. But it's not going to do this long-term hockey stick growth that equities do. It'll kind of trade in this like range, but it won't crash, as much as equities will, but it won't go up as much either. But in exchange, you get a steady income. And REITs, which stand for Real Estate Investment Trusts, are corporations that own real estate, like apartment buildings, shopping malls, old folks' homes, that kind of thing, in which they're the landlord. They do all of like the landlording stuff, and then they collect rent, and then they pass on the rent to investors like you and I. So those, at the time that I was invested in it, paid something like 4.5% to like 5%. So I was using some of these more alternative investments in order to get my yield up, because right in that transition period between not fire and fire, you do need yield more, and because you want to guard against sequence of return risks. But on your way up to that, and when you're just accumulating, you don't need any of those assets. And even a few years after that sequence of return risk has kind of died down, you also kind of don't need those assets anymore. So in that 3 to 5 year period after I retired is when I owned all this stuff, but gradually I've kind of eliminated most of it, and now I've returned back to kind of more of a pure indexing strategy. I still have preferred shares because those pay really well right now, but that's basically the last thing that I have. Eventually, I'm going to move back to like a pure bond index, probably in the next year or so.
Man, how did you learn all this stuff, Bryce? I thought you were an engineer. You sound like you got a finance degree. I mean, this was like CFP level stuff that I barely remember.
Your yield shield and the assets you use to mitigate sequence of returns risk. And Bryce just took us through the philosophy of using preferred shares, REITs, corporate bonds, and dividend stocks. And that you've now transitioned back out of that. And you've seen your portfolio since in the last 9 years double. And expenses haven't gone up. So it's an incredible story about how you've not only fired, but grown your portfolio. And at the same time, you didn't succumb to lifestyle inflation.
The not succumbing to lifestyle inflation is all her.
But who knows? Like, we might get super bougie in the next month. Who knows?
Yeah, Bryce was totally taking us to school with these, different types of dividends and preferred shares and all of that. So great job. I mean, I think we learned a lot with that. And to know that there are so many different options if you want to create that yield.
I'm kind of like a finance nerd. I really do I really actually enjoy reading about this stuff. She is more on the expenses side. So she will tell you like how much we spent on oranges like last month kind of thing, right? And she has like all the spreadsheets and does all the tracking and that kind of thing. So my job in this relationship is to make sure that the investments are performing at a level that we need to and is giving us what we need to as well. Because sometimes it's not just about growth. Sometimes you want income as well. So learning how to shift between those two mindsets has been quite a fascinating journey for me. And I do legitimately enjoy reading about this stuff and learning about it. And Kristy has successfully managed to play defense and keep our expenses from growing. So you put those two together and then it just becomes this endlessly growing pile of money that we are honestly having trouble spending.
Yeah, well, that is a challenge in today's fire community of folks that did what you did. Hey, Catching Up to Fi audience, this is Bill Young telling you that we have some great sponsors here on our show these days. Jeremy Schneider, who's been on the show and is the founder of Personal Finance Club, has created a couple of great courses that he is giving to our audience at a $30 discount. Click on the link in the show notes to get this deal, and you can have the course, How to Money Like a Millionaire, which normally is $99, but you can get it for $69 using the code CUTOFI if you click on the link in our show notes. The other course that he does is called Build Wealth by Investing in Index Funds. And again, this course is only $99 normally, and it's such a great value already, but you can get $30 off and pay $69 for this course as well. Now, why not take them both? Buy his Ultimate Personal Finance Bundle, which again is normally $149, but you get $30 off the bundle if you use the code CUTOFI. Go to the show notes and find the link for these courses and get started on your personal finance journey. And one of the things that catapulted you into fire, and I'm glad Kristy's back with us because you guys have unique perspectives on housing. And I wanted to jump into that a little bit because, J.L. Collins is known to be a little anti-house, but you guys take it to a new level. And what is your philosophy on housing and how did that catapult you into fire, really?
Actually, the whole reason why we started the blog and how that eventually turned into Quit Like a Millionaire is because we were ranting about housing. And what happened was when we lived in Toronto for 10 years while we were working, everyone was telling us, you have to buy a house. You'd be stupid not to buy a house and you're going to be financially ruined. And if you don't buy a house, you're going to miss out and you're going to be financially ruined. And the people that were saying this the most were actually my own parents. Because coming from an Asian background, housing is basically my parents' religion. So you can't say you're not going to buy a house because they will argue to the death with you about how renting is throwing your money away and buying a house is the best investment you could ever put your money into. And even though my parents taught me how to clip coupons and save all this money growing up, when it comes to a house, they thought getting into a debt for $1 million, to them, that was like nothing. It's like, that's a no-brainer. Oh, save 50 cents here, but get into $1 million of debt? Yeah, you should definitely do that. So we were really fed up with our coworkers, my parents, our friends, everybody telling us we have to buy a house. And given that my job was not stable and I was worried about outsourcing, it's only since gotten worse because now people are worried about AI. Back then it was outsourcing. Given that my job was unstable and everyone at work was super stressed to the point where one of my coworkers almost died at his desk and my boss had a blood clot. Given all those factors, getting into $1 million in debt to me seemed like a very bad idea. And so when we chose this fire path, initially we were actually trying to buy a house and then we just veered off that into the fire direction instead. And that turned out to be the best decision that we ever made. And even after we retired, the same people that said we were buying a house said that we were crazy for retiring and that it's just because we are in a bull market. If the stock market crashes, we're going to be begging our bosses to let us have our jobs back. And that's when I started the blog. And that's when I came up with the idea that it doesn't make sense to follow the boomers' advice, our parents' advice of saying, get a job, get a pension, and then buy a house and follow the usual script of life because the situation has changed and that script doesn't work anymore. And then the blog eventually grew and then turned into the book. So our stance on housing still has not changed. even though we have a kid. Actually, we're getting that pressure even more. Because like, now you have a kid, now you definitely have to buy a house. Even though you've been doing just fine for the last 10 years and retired and traveling the world, now you're going to be a bad parent if you don't buy a house. So what do we think about that? Are we terrible parents for not buying a house?
I don't care. I'm having too much fun because the thing is, housing has this tendency of stressing people out. Because even if a house is, like, for example, a good deal and it's gone up in value, you can't actually spend any of that money until you sell it. And my philosophy when it comes to money is, if you can't buy a Big Mac with it, it's not real money. Like, that's the kind of thing that I keep telling all the Bitcoin people that keep pitching me about, like, oh, do you want to sell Bitcoin in your block? I'm like, if you can't actually buy, like, food with it, it's not real money. And the same thing too with housing equity. Even if your house has gone up by, like, an insane amount of money, unless you sell it, you can't do anything with it. So, first of all, we have this philosophy. Because of that philosophy, I always consider housing equity to be kind of like fake wealth, like paper wealth. And second, we just love traveling too much. And when you have a house, I'm sure that you guys have noticed, you worry about it endlessly. You know, like, what's going on with my house? Like, are the pipes going to burst? Is somebody going to break into my house? Is something going to happen to it? Is it going to set on fire? I need to have somebody to watch it, and I have to someone have to check in on it, and that kind of thing. And then that really kind of gets in the way of doing the lifestyle that we know and love, which is, you know, kind of long-term nomadic travel.
Yeah, I can definitely attest to that. I've been in my house for a long time, so it's probably going to serve me well when I get the money out. But my next move is going to be renting. I just don't want the headache of a house that you're talking about. Yeah. There's just always something that needs to be fixed. And just right now, like you guys, I want to do more traveling and all of that. So everything you just said, I'm like, yeah, I'm there.
Well, you guys, people talk about, should I rent, should I buy? And in your book, you guys have a really great rule of thumb that accounts for the invisible expenses of owning a house. And can you take us through that rule of 150 that you talk about in your book?
Yeah, sure. So most people, or rather a lot of people, when they talk about whether the rent to buy argument, they look at the mortgage costs versus renting an equivalent house. And they kind of go, okay, well, which one is lower? And if the mortgage is lower, then do that, right? So that doesn't take into account a lot of unexpected when it comes to housing. When you own a house, you have to worry about a lot more than just the mortgage. You have to worry about insurance. You have to worry about utilities. You have to worry about maintenance is huge. I mean, like, I know lots of friends that have, you know, ended up buying condos or buildings or houses somewhere, and then like a few months into it, then they realize, oh, something is leaking in the basement, and then that somehow costs $30,000-$40,000 to fix. You know, so those are the kind of surprise expenses that renters just don't think about, because when something goes wrong with a rental, it's the landlord's problem. And a lot of people don't budget for, what if $50,000 worth of expenses happen all at once, because those things can and do happen. So yeah, it's rule of 150 is meant to kind of take into account all these like unexpected expenses. And we kind of tallied up all of the housing costs of a typical house that was owned for a typical period of, I believe it was like 7 to 8 years is how long it takes for, not how long an American owns a house for. And so we realized that it's not just the mortgage, it's the mortgage plus about 50%. So you need to take the mortgage cost of whatever the bank's going to give you and then add about 50% to it, and then compare that to what it would cost to rent in your area. And then if your owning the house is still lower, then yeah, do that. So it's kind of like a more balanced approach and a more conservative approach to figuring out whether it makes sense to own a house. And it's good to be conservative when it comes to making a big decision like buying a house, because buying a house is really easy to get into, but it's really hard to get out of if you realize that you don't like it.
Yeah, and we're talking in 2024, and it's even more crazy than everything that you mentioned in terms of not being enough houses available, the interest rates for mortgages. I mean, that's just all compounded right now.
Yeah, and all that stuff I hadn't like, and back then, I think in the book I wrote something. We wrote about like seeing this house in our city that was like worth $500,000, and we were like, that's nuts. And that just sounds downright adorable now, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, it does.
Right?
It sure does.
It was a bad deal then. It's even worse now. And then people are still kind of going into it. And I don't know. At first I was like, these are just different philosophies. You know, you do your thing. I'm going to do my thing. You know, I'm not going to try to influence you. You don't try to influence me. And I went and traveled and I had a great time. But all of these other factors that have come up, inflation, interest rates that have risen from like a benchmark rate of like basically 0.25 all the way up to like 5% on like the federal funds reserve rate, causing mortgages to spike up. Like, you guys actually have the benefit of when you guys say 30-year mortgage or 30-year mortgages, you actually mean 30-year fixed rate mortgages that don't actually change. In Canada and a lot of other places in the world, our mortgages reset. Our mortgages are sold in terms, like they're kind of sold in 5-year slices. So for us, when we have a 25-year mortgage, you get a certain interest rate for 5 years. And then at the end of the 5 years, it then resets to whatever the prevailing interest rates are. You have to renew. So as annoying as rising interest rates has been for the mortgage market or the housing market in the US, the effect is even worse here because we're now seeing a lot, like every year, 20% of homeowners have to renew their mortgage because it's in 5-year windows. And so every year, 20% of mortgage holders in Canada are seeing their mortgage rates jump by like double or triple. So the thing that was causing the great financial crisis in 2008, where you guys are doing ninja loans and like these zero down, zero income and all these kinds of.
So what's a ninja loan? We got some people who might not know what ninja loan is.
No income, no job, no assets. See, a ninja loan sounds cool, but it actually does, because I'm just like, oh, I want a loan from a ninja. That sounds awesome. I don't want to go to a bank. Exactly.
Yeah, there's a movie that had that. And at the time, I didn't know what it was, but I definitely know now. And I'm like, okay, that totally makes sense.
Yeah. So for you guys, the great financial crisis was caused by all these mortgage holders, their rates, their mortgage payments jumping up insanely because people locked in relatively low teaser rates. And then when it reset, they didn't realize it would reset up that high. And that was with interest rates remaining relatively the same. In Canada, being the smug bastards we are, we looked at that and said, oh, that kind of silly thing would never happen up here. But guess what? It's happening up here. So, hubris goes before the downfall is what I've been telling myself a lot.
Well, I was going to ask about so Canada has no 30-year fixed loans.
No.
They're all adjustable where you might get a low rate for the first 5 years. Okay, I don't know why I didn't know that. Did you know that, Bill?
No, I didn't. And it goes to show you that finances are personal but different according to location. And we get a little bit tunnel visioned in the U.S. that everybody's like us. And it's nice to hear that there's other perspectives and, different models that, make financial difference for citizens of other countries. Now that Kristy's back with us, I want to end the show by talking a little bit about change, because our late starters have a hard time both waking up and changing to a DIY philosophy. And one thing that Kristy did that sort of embodies the ability of a human to adapt and change is, Kristy, you didn't learn to swim until you were 24 years old. Is that right?
Yep. I was terrified of water, and when I learned to swim, I took my first YMCA lesson because we had gone to the Caribbean, and I felt very left out because everybody else was swimming, and I was just terrified. And he was like, Bryce would swim and like wave to me, and I would just sit on the shore, and I felt like I should probably finally get on this. And then it took me about 3 or 4 months with YMCA lessons with all the other children. I was pretty much the oldest person there to learn how to swim.
And now you've gone diving all over the world. That's just fascinating to me how, you can overcome fear, like the fear of being a late starter. And I think that embodies kind of what we're about with encouraging late starters to embrace forgive what had happened before, embrace where they're at, and then change their financial mindset philosophy in order to create an action plan. And your swimming story, I think, is really a great way to end, because we can all learn to swim in the financial world. We just have to, I like that metaphor.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor.
And I say it's never too late.
Yeah, we love that. Well, I have to say that I also share your interest in writing. And I heard you talk a lot about, diversity in writing and things like that. But you have a book that came before Quit Like a Millionaire, and that was Little Miss Evil.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little about that?
Oh, yes. That was us trying to write a children's book, because it was always my passion to become a writer. But when I did the pot score, it just made no sense to get a creative writing degree. And I knew that was not something that I could live off of, which actually proved to be true. Because when we wrote on the side while becoming engineers, I think I probably made like maximum $5,000 from 7 years of writing.
I hear you on that.
So that kind of worked out. And Little Miss Evil was our passion project where we wrote about a girl whose dad is a supervillain and wants her to take on the evil empire, but she just wants to be a kid and she has no interest in doing that. But then her dad gets kidnapped and then she has to go rescue him. So she's kind of forced into that role, even if she doesn't want it. So that project actually might also help your readers who think that it's too late to start something or fire is too hard. So from learning how to write, that book ended up getting nearly that was actually the third book that we had written. We had written other children's novels before that, and the other two failed. And even getting Little Miss Evil published, before it got published, the other two books, everything together, ended up racking up 200 rejection letters from literary agents and from editors. And at some point you want to give up because you're like, this is way too hard. But at the end of the day, to go from that stepping stone to where we are now with Quit Like a Millionaire with 150,000 copies sold, like, it's just mind blowing. I think Little Miss Evil probably sold, I don't know, like less than 5,000 copies. So it's just mind blowing how far you can get if you commit to a task and a goal and work towards it, even if you have many, many failures along the way. Because everybody always wants to show the end result. Like, look, I have $1 million. Look, I built this successful business. They don't want to show you along the way how many times they wanted to give up and how many rejection letters they have. So if I could, I would print out all of those 200 rejection letters and then just give it to your audience to see that this is just part of the journey, and don't give up if it gets really hard. There's just going to be a lot of failure and rejection along the way, but it is worth it in the end.
Well, that speaks back to your CRAP philosophy, because the P is perseverance. And, you have a passion for diversity in books. Can you tell us why so? And there's a charity that you want to recommend, and we want our folks to think about that as well.
Oh, for sure. So we volunteered for a charity that was created in New York called We Need Diverse Books. And that came about because there's so many books that were published that a lot of minorities and marginalized people don't really relate to, because a lot of the characters do not reflect the cultural background or their appearance. So as a result, you don't really see yourself in books. And if children don't see themselves in books, then they're not going to try to be the hero of the story. They're just going to think that they're always the sidekick. And why is that? What we wanted to help by becoming the technology directors and volunteering for this organization to help bring awareness and to help find more books where everybody can see themselves as a hero, because we want to tell our story, not just like the majority story. And that's why we advocated for We Need Diverse Books, and why I think that it's really important to have diversity in books. And even writing Quit Like a Millionaire, I didn't see a lot of my story represented in the FIRE space or in any personal finance book that I had read up until that point. Nobody really talked about like what it's like to have a scarcity mindset, and what if you don't have a safety net of parents or other people or the government's going to take care of you. It really is, from a minority's point of view, there's no one coming to save you, and you need to save yourself. That was the theme of my book, because I had not seen any other book that was like that. And so many people with talking about abundance mindset didn't quite understand that abundance mindset is not something that you just automatically get if you grew up in poverty and in scarcity. It's something that is a privilege, and it's something that you can develop over time, but not everybody starts at that point. So one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about diversity in books is to represent everybody's experience, and so people can read it and feel heard and seen, so that they don't just give up on the journey. They don't just go, oh yeah, FIRE is just for privileged people. What is the point of doing this? I don't see myself reflected. Just like those children's books that we saw when we were writing Little Miss Evil, in which people are like, okay, well, I'm just the sidekick. I'm never going to be the hero of the story. What's the point of trying?
Well, I would encourage you to write a late starter book. We feel that we're the silent majority. The average American's a late starter. And maybe you can write a children's book for late starters about showing them that they're a diverse population and allowing us and our demographic to be seen and heard as well.
That is a great idea. And I love the title of your podcast and the fact that you are making people feel heard and seen, that they're not going to give up just because they think it's too late to catch up.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And well, I mean, we really love what you've put out there, and your lens is definitely different than what I was hearing. You know, I retired at the end of 2019, and the voices were mostly the same, and you were one of those voices that was different. And, you know, it just helped me to say, hey, there's other people that grew up in poverty that kind of get, you know, that whole perspective of the scarcity and the fear of being in poverty again. So kudos to you and Bryce for putting that out there. I think it's an important contribution to the FIRE community. And I, for one, really, really appreciate that body of work.
No, thank you so much, Jackie.
Yeah, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah.
I think your message is really important for our audience. It may be one of early success, but it is one of success, and it tells our community that they can succeed too if they embrace the path like you guys did. You know, failure is not an option. We do need to be taking care of ourselves, and you show us how to do it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, and where can people reach you if they want to reach out or find your book?
Yeah, so they can go to our blog, revolution.com. And our book is published from Penguin, so you can basically buy it off any bookstore that's near you.
All right, Bryce, Little Matchstick, and Kristy, we just wanted to thank all three of you for joining us on the show. And we look forward to talking to you again about how your journey evolves. Jackie, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just been amazing chatting with you guys. We're so honored that you spent this time with us. We know it is a handful being parents, but so glad that you gave us a little bit of your day. So you guys keep on, and we'll be watching your journey. It's so exciting.
Yeah, you've juggled the child in a podcast well. We appreciate it, as will our audience.
This was unique because we've done podcasts with him before, and when he's younger, he'll just be just staring and then not really reacting to things. Now he's in a much more destructive mood. So it's we have to kind of make stuff up as we go. We weren't actually sure how we were going to do this, but I'm glad it worked out.
And he didn't hang up the laptop,
for sure,
which was very helpful.
It's just a great show. Thanks again for being here. We'll see you guys next week on Catching Up to 5.
So, Bill, as you know, we cannot do this show without our amazing staff and the people that help us put this on. So our social media is Diana Falk, our editor, Fritz Bassard, and show notes are done by Sarah von Sternberg. We love them, and they keep us going.
Yeah, I mean, this show wouldn't have the quality it has without our folks, our peeps. And we'd also like to give you a few calls to action for the show. We love our community, and we hope you love us back. If you want to support the show and what we're doing, you can do that at Buy Me a Coffee, which is a platform that allows you to virtually say thank you if you get value from our content. The link is in the show notes, or you can head over to our website at catchingupto5.com and click on the Support the Podcast tab at the top right. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Catching Up to 5. We would appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star review so that our message can reach others.
While we are financial educators, and I'm a financial professional that loves to teach, our content is for general education and information purposes only. We are not providing financial, legal, or tax advice. Always do your own research or consult a professional before making important decisions.
We'll see you next time on Catching Up to 5.